Hi there and welcome to another edition of Trash Compactor. In this episode I'll be showing you how to make a custom X-Wing pilot. So I'm going to use a beta figure. This is a vintage X-Wing Luke. He's in pretty poor condition, his limbs are rubbish, he's got really bad rub, he is not fit for display. I've got a collection of these which I'm using. You can pick them up quite cheaply. There's a lot of them about, and whatever you do, just don't use a good quality figure. For this build I'm going to be doing General Merrick, who is from Rogue One. He's Blue Leader, and to do that I'm going to be using an Uncle Owen head and customizing that to make General Merrick. So first things first, I'm going to pop the figures into a cup of boiling water and use the Toy Palitoy pop and boil method. Leave them in for a little while to soak and get nice and soft. 5 minutes should do it. Once they've been in there for 5 minutes, take them out and you should find the heads easy to pop off the figure. So do the same to Luke. This is a vintage style figure, so the heads have a longer neck, usually a little bit more difficult. You have to be very careful. They are old and brittle, but they will come out with a little bit of gentle persuasion if you've left them in long enough. As you can see, the limbs are quite soft. I'm going to change the arms as well. I want hands with gloves, so I've got a Nenum figure that I'm going to use, so I'm going to pop him in the water for 5 minutes. So as you can see, the pins are very different lengths, so I'm going to have to customize the Uncle Owen head to fit into the Luke body, or now as we call it, the X-Wing body. So Nenum has been in there a little while. It's just a case now of popping his arms off. I will take his head off and use that for another project. I also need Luke's arms to come off his body, so I've got to pop him back in the water, and while I'm doing that I'll trim Uncle Owen's head so I can fit it into the X-Wing body. So Luke's nice and soft now. Pop his arms off. If they don't come off first time, just pop them in for a little bit longer, but they're quite easy to come out. So Nenum's been in there a while. Pop his arms off. Again, if they're a bit too difficult, give it a bit longer in the water. Then the challenge is the pegs are both the same size. You've got to try and get them into the body. And the way I do this is I actually trim down the disc that usually holds the arms in place. You have to be careful doing this. If you take too much off, they're quite loose. They're generally quite loose, but I've got a method on how you can tighten them once they're on the figure. So trim those off, and then what will happen is that will allow the arm to fit back into the body quite nicely. So it's a case of popping the larger little notch in and then gently forcing in the smaller notch. Usually grab a little screwdriver or a pair of tweezers to do this, and that will pop back into the figure. Sometimes they're a tight fit, sometimes they're quite loose. Once they've gone in, give them a good spin, bit of a twist, and you can swap the arms out. So these will look good when they're painted because they'll have the gloves. You could just paint Luke's hands black, but I think you can sort of tell the difference. So I'll do the same on the other arm and then pop that into the body. So I've got both the arms in now. That'll look better when it's all painted. Next thing I need to do is to widen the hole in Luke's body. And to do this I'm just using my grinding tool on my Dremel and literally just trying to make the hole the same size as the Uncle Owen figure. I trimmed the head down while I was waiting for Nenum to soften, so it's just a case of giving it a good squeeze and it should fit on quite nicely and still turn. So the head's on the figure now. What I need to do now is give the face a little bit of a trim to shape the hair to look like General Merrick's. So I've trimmed Uncle Owen down to try and make him look a little bit more like the figure. Give the rubber head a squeeze with a pair of pliers. This just narrows the head a little bit. It's easy to do. One thing I was wanting to think about doing was using the original head as a helmet. So what I did is I dremeled out the actual face and the content of the head to make a soft vintage helmet to fit on Uncle Owen's head. So after a little bit of neatening, you can see that the helmet does actually fit on there. So if this is what you're wanting to do, great helmet, looks good, still looks quite vintage, sort of matches the Luke figure. So sometimes on the figure you find that the limbs are very loose. There's a way of tightening up, and that's using something called liquid poly. What I do put on a little liquid poly under each arm, allowing it to run in between the joint. I do this on both sides, making sure it goes in between the joint and the body. And then once this is done, this sort of starts to bond the plastic. But if you keep moving the joint every 5 or 10 minutes for about half an hour, it stops it tightening up solid, but it will actually cause the plastic to slightly bond or expand, and it creates a tighter joint on your figure. So as you can see, I've added the liquid poly and it's had a time to dry. Keep moving the arms every 5 to 10 minutes and they'll start to stiffen up. So my figure's properly dried off now. His arms are now completely movable and they'll stay where they are. Next thing I'm going to do is, with General Merrick, he has a detail down the side of his sleeves. So I'm going to use some milli putty. Follow the instructions on your packet. It's a case of chopping one from each of the tubes, mixing them together. It says for about 7 minutes. And then it's a case of taking a small piece, rolling it out into a very, very long sausage that will fit down each arm. So cut that to size, applying this down the side of your figure's arm. So do this on both sides. Trim it off with a Stanley knife. And then this does take several hours to dry, so you've got plenty of time to play with it. So give it a good squish down. You could use the back of your knife to put the ridges in, but I have found a way of imprinting a pattern on, which is to use a cable tie. And you can use this and imprint it down the arm and it creates the ridges. So however you want to do this, it's quite tricky, but it's just quite effective, and give it a good press. And once you've done that, this will then push the milli putty to the side, and it's just a case of trimming off the excess that you don't need. So using the flatter blade, just drag it down and cut away the excess. So once you've neatened up all the edges and made that look smart, it's just a case of leaving the figure probably to dry overnight. Probably the best thing, it usually takes about 4 to 6 hours for milli putty to go hard. The longer you leave it, the better it will be. So my figure's been drying for a little while now, and what I'm going to do is take this Luke helmet that I've got from a figure that I utilised for some other X-Wing pilots that I've done, and I'm just going to mask off some sections of the helmet and then paint them in the pale blue so it matches the style of General Merrick's helmet. This is very fiddly. As you can see, I'm using a matte 65 paint. I'm just going to apply that to a sponge and then gently sponge that over the area that's not masked. When that's done and tacked off a bit, just peel away the masking tape carefully and you'll see you've got a nice, neat, straight line down the middle of the helmet. So I'll touch up the edges just to make it a bit neater. And then it's a case of painting the rest of the helmet to match General Merrick's. And then I'm going to paint with the same blue very carefully down the sides of the ridge of the helmet so it matches and blends in. You can mask this off if you wish, but you don't need to. So to paint the rest of the helmet, I'm going to use the acrylic paint number 156. You could use matte 30, which is quite greenish, or matte 27, which is darker. I quite like the 156, it just seems to be the right grade. It's got a bit of a shine to it as well, which is sort of matches a vintage style. And it's just a case of putting the paint on and infilling it around the gaps. So I'm going to use this matte 24 now just to add in the yellow details on the helmet. And this will be for filling in the red dots to turn them yellow. And also filling in the side where the head strap meets the helmet. Last thing to do is, in the same blue as the stripe, is to then paint in the Rebel emblem. This is incredibly tricky. You could actually use the Toy Palitoy transparent stickers, so paint the helmet all over white. As you can see, not the neatest job ever, but you could use the Toy Palitoy stickers and that would give you better emblems. So my figure's completely dried now, his arms are completely solid. What's left to do now is to just give them one last neaten up while it's dried. Scrape off any bits you don't want to show when it's painted. Remember, you can't reshape it here, you don't need to sand it, just in case neatening it up. So for General Merrick, I'm going to use matte 25. This is a good colour blue, a little bit brighter than the actual outfit, but works well for the figure and sort of fits the vintage style. You can be quite generous with your painting because there's lots more touching up to do for all the different areas of the strap and the chest panel and the arms. So give it a good coat of paint and then leave that to dry. So he's dried off now, and I'm now going to concentrate on painting his head. So this is to paint in his hair, sideburns and fantastic moustache. So I shaped the figure's head earlier so I could actually get the right shape of the hairline, and then painting in the moustache with a super fine brush, and it really does look like a porn tash. And then there's painting in the eyebrows, very delicate job. You've got to make him as thin as possible or he ends up looking like he's permanently surprised. So I've got his eyebrows and his moustache done, and now it's a case of touching up the figure. As you can see, I've painted the arm ridges white and the body, and I've also done the grey around the belt and the straps. On the vintage figures, the main strap around the crutch is black and the strap on the legs is white, but I just went with grey purely for the effect of matching General Merrick's outfit. So to paint the hose and the instrument panel, I'm going to use the dark grey, matte 27. And then I'll leave him to dry off. So for all the black detail, I'm going to use matte black 33 to paint the straps. I originally started painting the grey and then realised they needed to be black, so do the front straps around the back of his neck very carefully, following the raised ridge around the figure. And then once you've done that, leave that to dry off. If you've got any little bleeds or areas that have gone onto the white chest part, just a case of touching them up. And then once he's dried, give the feet a paint with black gloss. So he's dried off now. I've touched up all the finer details to smarten him up. Last detail is to put on the silver parts on his boot, and then it's just a case of putting a very, very small silver mark at the top and the bottom of each one on the right hand leg. So his helmet's painted, he can now hold it, he's all painted and dried off. As you can see, it was quite effective. It's not the most spitting image of General Merrick, but you get the general idea. A lot of the figures don't look exactly like their originals. And what I like about it is you can take his helmet on and off, which is quite a nice effect you never got with the original figure. And there we have Blue Leader. So I've done the same principle to a lot of other different Rebel figures. Here we've got the original vintage X-Wing pilot Luke, or generic pilot as it could be. So a bit of a comparison, you can see the difference. I've applied a similar thing to a Luke figure with using the head from a ball jointed Luke X-Wing pilot that I didn't like the body and the bendable arms and legs, so I chopped the neck off and applied that to the figure and then painted it the way I had in this session. With Porkins, he was pretty much as he was, just the colouring was completely wrong, so I just touched up his body to match the vintage style figures. Helmets come on and off, which is always a bit of a nice touch. And then with Biggs, again another moustached character, so his helmet comes off, use the head from another Biggs figure, and you can see that was a peg joint, so that was easy to pop in. And then we've got a wedge, and again that's the bull neck joint, so that was a case of cutting the neck off the other figure and gluing it on to the X-Wing body. I then had a go at making a custom Y-Wing pilot, so I didn't have a head for this one. So what I did is I had a pretty beaten up General Nadine. I sort of shaved off his beard, painted his hair yellow. Also I had a figure which was a really horrendous Y-Wing pilot. So I cut his legs and his boots off and applied them to the figure, so it just looked a little bit different from the X-Wing pilot, and also used the instrument panel and the hose. So I think quite successful little fleet of characters. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe.